There is a cave in Siberia. It sits in the Altai Mountains, carved into a limestone cliff above the Anui River, and for most of human history, nobody paid it much attention. Local people called it Denisova Cave, named after an 18th century hermit who once lived there. For a long time it was just a place. Cold in winter, quiet, forgotten. Then, in the summer of 2010, a team of scientists from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, sat down with a fragment of bone recovered from that cave. Not a skull, not a jaw, a single piece of a finger, a child's finger, so small it fit easily in the palm of a hand. They extracted DNA from it, ran their analysis, and discovered something that the existing map of human history had absolutely no room for. This was not a Neanderthal. This was not a Homo sapiens. This was something else entirely. A whole branch of humanity, one that had walked the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, that had interbred with our ancestors, whose genetic signature still lives today in the bodies of people in Tibet and Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australia, and we had never known they existed. Not one text, not one legend attributed to them by name, nothing. Just a fragment of bone, sitting silently in the dark, waiting. That discovery did not make the front page of most newspapers. It did not change the way history is taught in most schools. The world moved on, and that cave and what it told us about who we really are quietly settled back into the background. But here is what stayed with the scientists who worked that case, and with the researchers who have spent their careers at sites just like it. Findings like the one at Denisova Cave are not isolated. They are not flukes. They are part of a pattern, a recurring signal in the archaeological record that keeps surfacing at dig sites and cave systems and museum storage rooms around the world. Evidence that something about the story of humanity is longer, stranger, and far more layered than the version most of us were handed. This documentary is about that pattern. We are going to look at 8 ancient populations, 8 categories of beings, if you want to call them that, whose traces have been found buried in the earth, encoded in the oldest texts ever written, and locked inside the human genome itself. Some of them have been confirmed by peer-reviewed science, some remain deeply contested, and some exist in that uncomfortable space between documented archaeological anomaly and cultural memory, so old that no one alive can say with certainty what the original source was. Every claim you hear in this film is anchored to something real, a named site, a dated sample, a researcher or institution you can look up. When we move into theory or interpretation, we will tell you that is what we are doing. The goal here is not to tell you what to believe. The goal is to show you what has been found, and to ask, honestly, why so little of it has been widely discussed. In 2013, a team of scientists lowered themselves through a passage in the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, a passage so narrow that only researchers of a specific body size could fit through it, and at the bottom, in a chamber that had sat undisturbed for what may be 250,000 years, they found bones, hundreds of them, belonging to a creature with a brain roughly 1/3 the size of yours. A creature that, by every traditional measure of cognitive development, should not have been capable of the thing the evidence suggests it was doing down there, burying its dead, deliberately, in the dark, in Peru, on a peninsula that juts into the Pacific Ocean south of Lima. Archaeologist Julio Tello recovered a collection of skulls in 1928 that have been sitting in museum storage and generating quiet, unresolved questions ever since. Some of those skulls show clear evidence of intentional cranial binding, a practice documented across dozens of ancient cultures, but a subset of them have a bone structure that does not match the expected result of that practice. One parietal plate where most human skulls have 2, separated by a sagittal suture. The anatomy is different. The official literature has not fully settled on what that means. And in southeastern Turkey, on a limestone ridge near the city of Şanlıurfa, there is a site called Göbekli Tepe. It was excavated beginning in 1994 by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, and has been generating serious questions ever since. The carved stone pillars there are approximately 12,000 years old, roughly 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. The people who built them, according to the best available evidence, were hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no permanent settlements that we have found, and yet they organized the labor, the logistics, and the symbolic knowledge required to raise T-shaped columns, 5.5 meters tall, covered in detailed animal carvings and abstract symbols whose meaning we have not decoded. Around 8000 BCE, someone buried the entire complex under tons of clean fill, on purpose. And then it sat there beneath the hill for 10,000 years, until a Kurdish shepherd noticed something unusual about the ground, and a German archaeologist decided to dig. Only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest there are at least 16 additional enclosures still beneath the surface. Whoever built it, whatever social structure or belief system, or chain of inherited knowledge produced it, left almost no other trace. Before we go any further, if you have found your way to this film and this is your first time here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly this kind of exploration, the long, slow, carefully sourced kind, where we follow the evidence wherever it leads, and we do not pretend the gaps in the record are smaller than they are. If that sounds like something you want more of, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you do not miss what is coming. There are 8 beings to account for, and the story only gets stranger from here. Now, let us talk about the pattern. Because here is the thing that tends to get lost when these findings are reported individually, in separate journal articles, and separate documentary segments, and separate corners of the internet. When you lay them side by side, when you map the Denisovans and Homo naledi, and the Göbekli Tepe builders, and the beings described in the oldest written texts on Earth, onto the same timeline, something becomes visible that is easy to miss when you are only looking at one piece at a time. Every ancient culture, on every inhabited continent, preserved some version of the same memory, a time before, a time when the world was shared with beings who were not quite like us, older, in some descriptions, or wiser, or physically different, or both. The Sumerians wrote about them in cuneiform on clay tablets that are now sitting in museums in London and Chicago. The authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls described them in texts that spent 2,000 years sealed in ceramic jars in the caves above Qumran. The Aboriginal Australians painted them on rock walls in the Kimberley region, in images that have been dated to somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. The conventional explanation is that these are myths, metaphors. The way ancient minds processed fear, or power, or the unknown. That may be exactly right, and we will look at that explanation seriously, because it has serious scholarly support. But there is another possibility, one that the last 15 years of ancient DNA research has made harder to dismiss than it once was. What if some of those memories are not metaphors? What if they are in some form compressed, distorted, reshaped by 10,000 years of retelling something closer to a record? That is the question this film is built around. Not whether ancient astronauts landed in Mesopotamia, not whether giants walked the earth in the way that 19th century newspapers like to claim, but something more grounded, and in many ways, more profound. Whether the human story is longer than we think, whether the beings our ancestors remembered and feared, and revered, and wrote into the foundation texts of every major civilization were, in some cases, real, and whether the reason we stop talking about them has less to do with the evidence, and more to do with the institutions that decide what the evidence is allowed to mean. 8 ancient beings buried in the record, and we are only just beginning to dig. Let us go back to that cave. Denisova Cave sits at an elevation of roughly 700 meters above sea level, carved into the limestone of the Anui River Valley in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. It is not a large cave. The main chamber runs about 9 meters wide and 9 meters deep. By the standards of famous archaeological sites, it is modest, unremarkable, almost. And for most of the 20th century, that is exactly how the scientific community treated it, a site of regional interest, worth documenting, but not the kind of place that changes the map of human prehistory. That changed in 2010. The fingerbone fragment recovered from the cave, designated as coming from a young individual, likely a girl, based on the DNA analysis, was submitted to a laboratory at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. The team lead on the project was Svante Pääbo, a Swedish geneticist who had spent the better part of 2 decades developing techniques to extract and sequence ancient DNA from degraded bone. Pääbo had already made a significant name for himself by sequencing the Neanderthal genome in 2009. That work alone had reshaped how scientists understood human prehistory. It confirmed that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had interbred, that the two lineages were not cleanly separate, but tangled, that most people with European or Asian ancestry carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes today. But the Denisova finger bone was something else entirely. When the team completed their mitochondrial DNA analysis, the results showed a lineage that had diverged from the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans approximately 1 million years ago. To put that in terms that are easier to hold in the mind, the Denisovans split off from the lineage that would eventually produce both Neanderthals and us at roughly the same time that our shared ancestors were first spreading out of Africa. These were not a regional variant. They were not a subgroup. They were a third branch of humanity, ancient and parallel, that had been walking the earth for the entirety of human prehistory, and we had never known they existed. The paper was published in the journal Nature in December of 2010. The scientific community received it with a combination of genuine astonishment and immediate skepticism. Both responses were reasonable. The finding was extraordinary, and extraordinary findings require extraordinary evidence. But the evidence held. Subsequent full nuclear genome sequencing completed and published in 2012 confirmed and deepened the initial results. The Denisovans were real, and they had not simply coexisted alongside Homo sapiens. They had, at some point or points in the ancient past, interbred with us. Here is where the story stops being just a story about a fossil and starts being a story about every person alive today. If you are of Tibetan ancestry, approximately 6% of your genome carries a variant linked to Denisovan DNA. That variant, specifically a version of the EPAS1 gene, which regulates the body's response to low oxygen at high altitude, is the reason Tibetan populations can live and work and thrive at elevations that would cause serious physiological problems for most other people on Earth. The variant is not found at significant frequency in any other population. It appears to have been acquired through interbreeding with Denisovans, passed down through generations, and then selected for meaning. The individuals who carried it survived better in high-altitude environments and had more children over tens of thousands of years. That gene, in the bodies of millions of Tibetan people today, came from a population we did not know existed until 15 years ago. If you are of Melanesian ancestry from Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, or nearby island groups, the Denisovan signal in your genome runs even higher. Some populations carry up to 6% Denisovan ancestry. Pacific Islander and Aboriginal Australian populations show similar patterns. The geographic distribution of this signal is one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire Denisovan story, and we will come back to that in a moment. Archaeologists have noted that the physical evidence for Denisovans, the bones, the tools, the direct material record, is almost non-existent relative to the genetic footprint they left behind. From Denisova Cave itself, we have recovered 3 teeth, 2 partial finger bones, and a single fragment of skull. From a limestone cave on the Tibetan plateau near Shahe in Gansu province, we have 1 partial jaw found by a Buddhist monk in 1980, held in a monastery, studied by a local researcher, and then largely overlooked until 2019, when a team from Lanzhou University and the Max Planck Institute applied protein analysis and confirmed it as Denisovan. The jaw had been sitting in a monastery for nearly 40 years before anyone with the tools to identify it properly had the chance to do so. That is the entire skeletal record. 2 sites. Enough bone fragments to fill a small envelope. And yet the genetic evidence suggests that Denisovans occupied a territory stretching from Siberia to Southeast Asia to the islands of the Pacific, that they were present on Earth for somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 years, that they were genetically diverse enough across their range to have contributed distinct genetic packages to different modern populations in different geographic regions, implying that the interbreeding events between Denisovans and Homo sapiens were not a single occurrence but multiple, separate encounters spread across time and geography. What remains unexplained is the silence of the physical record. When a population exists for hundreds of thousands of years across a continental range, it leaves things behind. Bones accumulate in caves, tools get buried in river sediment, hearths leave charcoal that can be dated. The Neanderthal record, for comparison, includes hundreds of sites across Europe and Western Asia, skeletal remains, stone tool industries, evidence of pigment use, burial practices, worked eagle talons that may represent personal ornamentation. The material record of Neanderthal existence is rich enough that researchers have spent decades arguing about the fine details of their cognitive life. The Denisovans left almost nothing we can point to and say with confidence. One theory suggests that this absence is, in part, a sampling problem, that we have simply not been digging in the right places. Southeast Asia and island Melanesia, where the genetic signal is strongest, are regions where bone preservation is notoriously poor. Tropical humidity, acidic soils, and dense vegetation create conditions that destroy organic material quickly. The cave systems of Borneo, the Philippines, and Indonesia have yielded some ancient hominin remains, including the diminutive Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit of Flores Island, whose relationship to Denisovans is still being worked out, but systematic excavation of the region is still in relatively early stages. It is entirely possible that Denisovan campsites and burial sites are sitting undiscovered beneath the forest floor of islands that have barely been surveyed. One theory suggests something more unusual, that the Denisovans may have had burial or body disposal practices that systematically removed their physical remains from contexts where preservation was likely. Some researchers have noted, cautiously, that the extreme rarity of Denisovan bone, even in Denisova Cave itself, a site with excellent preservation conditions, is harder to explain by environmental factors alone. The cave preserved animal bones from the same time periods in abundance. It preserved plant material, pollen, and sediment layers with remarkable clarity. The absence of Denisovan skeletal material there is not simply a matter of poor conditions. Something about how they used the cave, or what happened to their bodies, worked against the accumulation of remains. We do not know what that something was. Now consider the geographic puzzle again, because it is genuinely strange. The highest concentrations of Denisovan ancestry in living people are found in Melanesia and among Aboriginal Australians, populations that live tens of thousands of kilometers from the only confirmed Denisovan cave. The Tibetan genetic contribution, which involves a different set of Denisovan genetic variants, came from what geneticists call a distinct Denisovan subpopulation, meaning the Denisovans encountered by the ancestors of Tibetans were not the same genetic group as those encountered by the ancestors of Melanesians. The range, the diversity, and the geographic spread of these interbreeding events all point toward a population that was, by any measure, a major presence in the ancient world. And yet when we look for them, we find almost nothing. Svante Pääbo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for his work on ancient human genomes, work that began, in large part, with that finger bone from a Siberian cave. The Nobel Committee's announcement described his discoveries as revealing something fundamental about what it means to be human. The press coverage that followed was respectful and extensive, but very few of the headlines asked what might be the most important question the Denisovan discovery raises. Not who were they? We have some of that answer now, but where did they go? And why? Given how long they existed, and how wide their range appears to have been, did they vanish so completely from the material record, leaving behind nothing but a faint signal written in the genomes of the people who live where they once walked? That question does not have a comfortable answer yet. And in the absence of a comfortable answer, what tends to happen in science and in culture alike is that the question gets quietly set aside, treated as a detail to be resolved by the next generation of researchers with better tools and more samples. But the question is still there, beneath the surface of every study on ancient DNA, beneath every paper about high-altitude adaptation in Tibetan populations, beneath every genetic survey of Pacific Islander ancestry. There was a population here before us. They were widespread, they were biologically successful, they shaped the genomes of people alive today. And then, as far as the physical record is concerned, they simply ceased to be, as if they had always been nothing more than a whispered possibility, rather than a living, breathing branch of the human family. And honestly, sitting with that thought for a moment, I am curious where you are right now as you are listening to this. Whether you are somewhere quiet, settled in for the night, or whether it is the middle of the afternoon and you just happen to find this film. Drop it in the comments. Where in the world are you, and what time is it there? There is something about this particular story, about a people who left traces in places as far apart as Siberia and the Solomon Islands, that makes me want to know how far this conversation is traveling. How many time zones? How many different corners of the world where, somewhere beneath the ground, the ancient record is still waiting to be read? The next site we are going to look at is even harder to explain, because at least the Denisovans are confirmed by science. What was found at the bottom of the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa was confirmed too, but what it implies about the nature of the beings who went down there may be even more unsettling. Picture the kind of darkness that has no bottom, not the darkness of a room with the lights off, where your eyes eventually find the outline of a window or the faint glow of something electronic, not the darkness of a cloudy night, where the sky still holds a certain pale quality even when you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The darkness inside the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa is the kind that is absolute, the kind that has sat undisturbed for geological stretches of time, pressed into the limestone, unbroken by any light source for hundreds of thousands of years, the kind of darkness that, if you stopped moving inside it, would give you no information whatsoever about where the walls were, or how far the floor dropped, or what was waiting at the bottom. Someone went down there anyway, deliberately. The Rising Star Cave system sits in the cradle of humankind, a UNESCO World Heritage Site roughly 50 kilometers northwest of Johannesburg. The region is one of the most fossil-rich in the world, a honeycomb of limestone caves and underground passages that has yielded remains of Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and now something that fit none of those categories cleanly. The system itself was known to local cavers for years before it became a scientific site. The specific chamber where the discovery was made, later named the Naledi chamber, from the Sesotho word for stars, was located at the end of a passage that narrowed, at one critical point, to approximately 18 centimeters wide. 18 centimeters, less than the width of a standard sheet of paper turned sideways. In 2013, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand put out an unusual call. He needed researchers who were qualified scientists, ideally with some background in excavation or paleoanthropology, and who were also small enough to fit through that passage. The team he assembled, eventually referred to in the press as the Underground Astronauts, was made up entirely of women. They lowered themselves through the chute, navigated the passage, and reached the Naledi chamber. What they found there was, by any measure, one of the most significant fossil discoveries of the 21st century. More than 1,500 bone fragments, belonging to at least 15 individual organisms, possibly more. The species was named Homo naledi, naledi meaning star in Sesotho, a nod to both the chamber's name and to the cave's location in the cradle of humankind. And from the beginning, Homo naledi was difficult to place. The skeleton combined features that, in the existing framework of human evolution, should not have appeared together. The feet were almost entirely modern, nearly identical to those of Homo sapiens, built for upright walking on varied terrain. The hands were mostly human in proportion, with one significant exception. The fingers curved in a way associated with climbing and gripping, suggesting a population that spent meaningful time moving through trees or vertical spaces. The skull was small. The brain, estimated from cranial capacity, ran somewhere between 400 and 600 cubic centimeters, roughly one-third the volume of the average modern human brain, and closer in size to much earlier hominins like Australopithecus. When the initial dating results came back, they added another layer of difficulty to the picture. Homo naledi had not lived in the deep past. In the early chapters of the hominin story, the individuals recovered from the Naledi chamber had lived somewhere between 235,000 and 336,000 years ago. At that point in time, Homo sapiens was already present in Africa. Homo naledi, with its ancient-looking skull and its small brain and its mosaic of primitive and modern features, was not a predecessor. It was a contemporary, a small-brained hominin living at the same time as anatomically modern humans, in the same general region of the world, navigating the same landscapes. That alone would have been enough to rewrite several chapters of the standard human evolution narrative. But then came the question that nobody could easily answer. How did 15 or more individuals end up in a chamber that could only be reached through a passage barely wide enough to breathe through? The most straightforward explanations were examined and set aside one by one. Flood transport, the idea that bodies had been carried into the chamber by water, did not hold up against the sediment record, which showed no evidence of the kind of hydraulic event that would have been required. Predator accumulation, the idea that a carnivore had been dragging prey into the cave, was ruled out by the absence of tooth marks on the bones and the absence of any non-Homo naledi animal remains in the assemblage. Accidental death, the idea that individuals had fallen into the system and become trapped, struggled to account for the sheer number of individuals and the presence of multiple age groups, from infants to elderly adults, in the same deposit. What remained, after the alternative explanations were tested, was something that the paleoanthropological community was deeply reluctant to accept. Intentional placement of the dead in a location that required effort, darkness, and physical difficulty to reach. In other words, something that looks, functionally, like a mortuary practice. Archaeologists have noted that intentional burial and body disposal have long been treated as cognitive milestones, behaviors that require abstract thought, a concept of death as a state distinct from life, and some form of social or symbolic meaning attached to the treatment of the deceased. These behaviors have traditionally been linked to larger-brained hominins. Neanderthals, whose burial practices remain a subject of ongoing debate, had brains comparable in size to modern humans. Homo sapiens burial is documented and widespread. The idea that a hominin with a brain, 1/3 the size of ours, was making deliberate decisions about where to place its dead, and accessing a chamber that required navigating total darkness and an 18-centimeter squeeze to reach, sat uncomfortably against decades of established thinking about the relationship between brain size and cognitive complexity. The discomfort in the scientific community was visible and documented. Multiple senior researchers in paleoanthropology published responses questioning the burial interpretation. The debate was not quiet or polite. It was substantive and pointed, and it reflected something real, not a conspiracy to suppress the finding, but a genuine collision between an extraordinary claim and a field that had spent a long time building its assumptions about what small-brained hominins were and were not capable of. Then, in 2023, Lee Berger and his colleagues published a new paper in the journal eLife. The paper described what appeared to be deliberate engravings on the walls of the naledi chamber, geometric shapes hashtag-like crosshatch patterns, simple lines, forms that have no obvious utilitarian function. The engravings were found in association with the Homo naledi remains. The dating, while still being refined, suggested they predated the presence of Homo sapiens in that specific chamber. If the engravings are confirmed as the work of Homo naledi, they represent the earliest known example of mark-making by any hominin in southern Africa, earlier, potentially, than comparable marks attributed to Homo sapiens at other sites on the continent. What remains unexplained is the full picture of what Homo naledi was doing down there. The engravings, if they hold up to further scrutiny, imply not just the physical act of descending into darkness with the dead, but something additional, a reason, a meaning attached to the space itself, a relationship between that specific chamber, in that specific cave, and whatever Homo naledi understood about death or memory. One theory suggests that the cognitive abilities required for symbolic behavior, for marking, for ritual, for the treatment of the dead as something other than biological matter may be less dependent on raw brain volume than the field has historically assumed. That the architecture of the brain, the specific organization of neural structures rather than their overall size, may be the more relevant variable. Some researchers studying Homo naledi's endocranial features have noted that despite the small overall volume, certain regions associated with social complexity and attention appear relatively well developed. That is a careful, measured claim. It does not resolve the question, but it opens a door that the standard model had kept firmly shut. Because here is what Homo naledi leaves us with. When all the debate and the counter-argument and the careful academic hedging is set aside for a moment, a small-brained hominin, living alongside early Homo sapiens in southern Africa, was descending into absolute darkness through passages barely wide enough to pass through, carrying or guiding its dead to a specific underground chamber and possibly marking the walls of that chamber with shapes that had no practical function. It was doing this not once, not accidentally, but as a repeated practice involving multiple individuals across generations. That behavior, in any species, at any point in the fossil record, would be considered remarkable. In a hominin with a brain the size of a clenched fist, it is something the field is still working out how to name. The ancient record has a way of doing this. Just when the categories seem settled, just when the timeline feels stable and the narrative feels coherent, something comes out of the ground that does not fit, something that was buried, undisturbed, for a span of time so long it resists easy comprehension, and that, in the act of being found, quietly rearranges everything around it. Homo naledi rearranged quite a lot, and the deeper we go into this story, the more we find that the beings who came before us were not simply primitive versions of what we eventually became. Some of them were doing things we are still struggling to explain, and some of the places where their traces survive are stranger and older and more carefully hidden than anything we have covered so far. There is a museum in Lima that holds a collection most visitors walk past without stopping. The skulls are displayed in glass cases, arranged in rows, and at first glance they read as simply old, the kind of ancient remains you expect to find in a natural history setting, labelled with dates and regional designations, treated as artifacts of a civilization that no longer exists. But if you slow down and actually look at them, something registers that is difficult to immediately categorize. The shape is wrong, not subtly wrong, not in the way that individual human variation produces faces and heads of different proportions, wrong in a way that takes a moment to process. Because the brain keeps trying to resolve what it is seeing into a familiar form and keeps failing to complete that resolution. The cranial vault extends upward and backward to a degree that falls well outside the normal range of human variation. In some, the wall is nearly as long from front to back as it is from base to crown. The overall volume of bone is, in several cases, measurably larger than a typical modern human skull. And these are not isolated specimens. The Museo Regional de Ica and the Museo Nacional de Arqueología, Antropología e Historia del Perú in Lima hold hundreds of them, recovered from a coastal desert region in southern Peru that has been generating archaeological questions since the 1920s. The site is the Paracas Peninsula, a finger of arid land jutting into the Pacific Ocean in the Ica region of Peru. Tello conducted excavations there and uncovered a necropolis, a buried cemetery of extraordinary scale containing mummified individuals wrapped in elaborate textiles, accompanied by ceramics, tools, and other grave goods. The Paracas culture, as it came to be known, flourished in the region from roughly 800 BCE to around 100 CE. Its textile work is considered among the finest produced anywhere in the ancient Americas. Its burial practices were sophisticated and clearly meaningful to the people who carried them out, and a significant number of the individuals buried in that necropolis had skulls that looked like the ones now sitting in those museum cases in Lima. The first and most important thing to establish clearly is this: intentional cranial modification is real, it is well documented, and it is not unusual in the ancient Andean world. The practice of binding an infant's skull, typically using boards, cloth, or other materials applied during the period of early childhood, when the cranial bones are still soft and unfused, produces elongated skull shapes that can be dramatic and visually striking. It was practiced across dozens of cultures on multiple continents, from ancient Egypt to the islands of Vanuatu to the pre-Columbian societies of the Andes. Researchers, including John Verano at Tulane University, one of the leading specialists in Andean bioarchaeology, have documented cranial modification extensively in Peruvian populations and have noted that the practice was likely associated with social identity, group membership, or ritual significance. For the majority of the Paracas skulls, intentional modification is the explanation. It fits the evidence, it fits the cultural context, and it does not require any additional hypotheses to account for what is observed. But there is a subset of skulls in the collection that has produced a more complicated conversation, and that conversation has been happening quietly in academic corridors and in forensic anthropology reports for longer than most people outside the field realize. The specific anatomical issue involves the parietal plates. In a standard human skull, the top of the cranial vault is formed by two parietal bones, one on each side, separated by a central joint called the sagittal suture. Cranial binding can change the shape of those bones significantly. It can flatten them, elongate them, and produce a dramatically different overall skull profile. What it cannot do, according to the established understanding of cranial anatomy, is alter the fundamental number of bones or eliminate the sutures between them. In a subset of the Paracas skulls, researchers have documented the presence of a single parietal plate, one continuous bone where two should be, with no sagittal suture present. The overall cranial volume in some of these specimens has been measured at values above the standard human range. The posterior plate, the bone at the back of the skull, is in some cases larger in surface area than is typically found in Homo sapiens. Archaeologists have noted that parietal foramina, small holes in the parietal bones, appear in some of the anomalous specimens in positions and sizes that differ from the standard human pattern. These are anatomical details. They are not interpretations. They are measurements that can be replicated by any qualified researcher with access to the collection. What those measurements mean is where the scientific consensus becomes less settled. In 2018, a DNA study on a sample of Paracas skull material was circulated in alternative research communities. The study was commissioned by researcher Brian Forster, who has spent years documenting the Paracas collection, and the samples were reportedly sent to a private laboratory in the United States. The results, as reported by Forster, suggested mitochondrial haplogroups with no exact match in known South American indigenous populations and some markers that the laboratory reportedly associated with populations from the region of the Black Sea or Eastern Europe. Here is where intellectual honesty requires a careful distinction. The study was not peer-reviewed. The chain of custody for the samples, meaning the documented trail of how the bone material was collected, stored, transported, and handled before reaching the laboratory, was disputed by several researchers who reviewed the reported methodology. Without peer review and without a verifiable chain of custody, the results cannot be treated as scientific findings in any meaningful sense. They are interesting. They may point toward questions worth pursuing through properly controlled research. They are not evidence of anything. What makes this frustrating is that the underlying anatomical questions are legitimate. The single parietal plate morphology in a subset of the skulls is a documented observation, not a fringe claim. It warrants proper scientific investigation, controlled sampling, peer-reviewed genetic analysis conducted by an accredited institution with full transparency about methodology. That investigation has not happened in any comprehensive, publicly available form. The reasons for that gap are probably mundane funding constraints, jurisdictional complexity around Peruvian cultural heritage law, the institutional reluctance to attach a major research program to a subject that has been heavily contaminated by fringe speculation. But the gap exists, and it means that a genuine anatomical anomaly in a significant archaeological collection has been sitting in a museum for nearly a century without receiving the level of rigorous scientific attention it arguably deserves. One theory suggests that the anomalous subset of skulls represents a distinct biological population that was present in the Andean region before or alongside the Paracas culture, a population whose remains were incorporated into Paracas burial practices because they were considered sacred, ancestral, or ritually significant. Under this interpretation, the skulls are not evidence of cranial modification at all. They are the actual remains of individuals who are anatomically different from the surrounding population. One theory suggests, alternatively, that extreme and early cranial binding applied to infants with an existing genetic predisposition toward unusually plastic cranial development could, in theory, produce more dramatic skeletal outcomes than binding alone typically achieves. This would not require a distinct population, only a combination of cultural practice and individual genetic variation. Neither theory has been tested against the full collection with the tools currently available. Ancient DNA sequencing technology, which has transformed our understanding of the Denisovans and dozens of other ancient populations in the last 15 years, has not been systematically applied to the Paracas skulls under conditions that would produce peer-reviewed results. What remains unexplained is not whether ancient cultures modified the skulls of their children. They did. That is settled. What remains unexplained is whether the specific subset of skulls displaying single parietal plates, elevated cranial volumes, and anomalous posterior bone structure can be fully accounted for by modification alone, or whether there is something in the biology of those individuals that the standard framework has not yet addressed. That is not a claim about ancient aliens. It is not a claim about a lost race of giants. It is a straightforward acknowledgement that a documented anatomical anomaly in a significant collection of ancient human remains has not been definitively explained by the published scientific literature. The Paracas skulls sit in their glass cases in Lima, hundreds of them. The questions they raise have been circulating for nearly 100 years, picked up and distorted and amplified by people with agendas on all sides, the researchers who see in them evidence of something extraordinary, and the institutions that find the entire conversation too contaminated by fringe association to engage with seriously. Somewhere between those two positions, the skulls themselves remain unchanged, holding whatever information they contain in the calcium of their ancient bone, waiting for the question to be asked cleanly enough and carefully enough that the answer might finally come back in a form that everyone can look at honestly. That kind of patience, it turns out, is something the ancient record has in abundance. The next site we are going to visit is not a cave or a museum. It is a hilltop in southern Turkey, and what was built there and then deliberately buried 10,000 years ago by the people who built it raises a different category of question entirely. Not about biology, about knowledge, about who taught the first civilizations what they knew, and where that teaching came from. Start with what we think we know. The standard model of early human civilization runs something like this. For most of prehistory, humans lived in small, mobile bands, hunting animals, gathering plants, following seasonal patterns across landscapes that were never permanently owned or settled. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago, something shifted. People in the Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East began cultivating grain, domesticating animals, and settling into permanent communities. Agriculture produced surplus food. Surplus food allowed populations to grow and diversify labor. Diversified labor produced specialists, builders, priests, administrators, craftspeople. Specialists produced cities. Cities produced writing, law, religion, and everything we associate with the word civilization. It is a clean sequence. It has a satisfying internal logic. And for most of the 20th century, the archaeological evidence seemed to support it well enough that the model became foundational. The kind of framework that gets reproduced in textbooks and taught in classrooms without much friction. Then a Kurdish shepherd noticed something unusual about a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, and a German archaeologist decided to investigate, and the clean sequence developed a problem it has not fully recovered from. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly as Potbelly Hill in Turkish. It sits on a limestone ridge in the Şanlıurfa province of southeastern Turkey, roughly 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa itself. The German Archaeological Institute had surveyed the region in the 1960s and noted the site without recognizing its significance. The hilltop appeared to be a Byzantine cemetery, and the large limestone slabs visible at the surface were initially interpreted as grave markers. The site was catalogued and set aside. In 1994, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, working with the German Archaeological Institute, took a second look. What he found beneath the surface changed the timeline of human civilization in ways the field is still working to absorb. The structures at Göbekli Tepe are monumental. Circular enclosures, up to 20 meters in diameter, built around pairs of central T-shaped limestone pillars that reach up to 5.5 meters in height and weigh up to 10 metric tons each. The pillars are not rough or unworked. They are shaped with precision, their surfaces carved with detailed bas-relief images, foxes, snakes, vultures, scorpions, aurochs, cranes, abstract symbols, and humanoid forms whose arms and hands are visible along the sides of the T-shaped shafts, suggesting that the pillars themselves may represent stylized human or semi-human figures standing in ceremonial posture. The site has been dated through radiocarbon analysis of organic material recovered from the fill layers to approximately 9,600 BCE at its oldest levels. That places the construction of Göbekli Tepe at roughly 12,000 years ago, approximately 7,000 years before the construction of Stonehenge, and several thousand years before the earliest evidence of agriculture in the surrounding region. Read that sequence again carefully, because it is the detail that carries the most weight. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, by the best available evidence, hunter-gatherers. They had no domesticated grain crops in the area at the time the earliest enclosures were constructed. They had no permanent settlement layer directly associated with the site, no storage facilities, no evidence of the kind of residential infrastructure you would expect to find if a community was living there continuously. They were mobile people, or semi-mobile people, who came to this hilltop and built something that required the coordinated labor of hundreds of individuals, sustained over extended periods of time, guided by a level of organizational and symbolic sophistication that the standard model reserved for societies that had already passed through the agricultural transition. One theory suggests that Göbekli Tepe inverts the standard sequence entirely, that it was not agriculture that made complex religious and architectural organization possible, but the reverse, that the need to maintain a sacred site, to feed the laborers who gathered there for ritual purposes, may have been one of the pressures that drove the development of agriculture in the first place. This hypothesis, associated with Klaus Schmidt and subsequently developed by other researchers including Stanford archaeologist Ian Queet, remains contested, but it has enough evidentiary support that it is now discussed seriously in mainstream paleoanthropological literature. What remains unexplained is the knowledge chain. Building and carving those pillars required not just organized labor but a transmission of technical skill, quarrying methods, carving techniques, symbolic vocabularies, architectural principles that implies a prior tradition of accumulated practice. You do not arrive at 5.5-meter precision-carved limestone monoliths on your first attempt. The structures at Göbekli Tepe are the product of a craft tradition that was already mature when they were built. Where that tradition came from, what it looked like in its earlier stages, and who carried it, these questions currently have no good answer, because the prior material record has not been found. Only about 5% of the site has been excavated as of 2024. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2021 by a joint team from Istanbul Technical University and the German Archaeological Institute identified at least 16 additional enclosures still buried beneath the hill. The two enclosures that have been most fully excavated represent a fraction of what the site contains. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was built to do, it was built at a scale that the excavated portion only partially suggests. And then, around 8000 BCE, someone buried it. Not through abandonment, not through the slow accumulation of debris that covers most ancient sites over time, but through a deliberate act of infilling. The enclosures were packed with clean sediment, animal bones, and stone tools material that had to be carried to the site and deposited intentionally. The burial preserved everything beneath it with remarkable fidelity. It also ended the site's active use, at least in the form it had taken during its peak. Why? That question has generated more speculation than any other aspect of Göbekli Tepe, and it remains genuinely open. The deliberate nature of the burial is not in dispute. The motivation behind it is entirely unresolved. Now drive roughly 500 kilometers to the northwest, to the Konya Plain in central Turkey, and the second site in this section comes into focus. Çatalhöyük is a large Neolithic settlement that was occupied from approximately 7500 BCE to around 5700 BCE, making it one of the earliest and largest proto-urban settlements yet discovered anywhere in the world. British archaeologist James Mellart conducted the first major excavations there between 1961 and 1965, uncovering a site of extraordinary density and strangeness. Current excavations are ongoing under the direction of teams from Stanford University and several British institutions. The settlement housed somewhere between 3,500 and 8,000 people at its peak, a population comparable to a small modern town, concentrated into a mud brick settlement with no streets, no central plaza, and no obvious administrative hierarchy in the architectural record. The houses were built directly against each other, sharing walls, and were entered not through doors at ground level, but through holes in the rooftops, accessed by wooden ladders. Movement through the settlement happened across the rooftops themselves. Inside the houses, the walls were covered in murals, geometric patterns, hunting scenes, and figures that have generated significant interpretive debate since Mellart first documented them. Some of the painted figures are unambiguously human in their overall form, but rendered with body proportions, particularly in the width of the torso and the relative size of the head, that do not correspond straightforwardly to naturalistic. Representation. Whether these represent stylized artistic conventions, ritual costumes or masks, symbolic abstractions, or something else, is a question that researchers at the site are still working through. Beneath the floors of the houses, Çatalhöyük's residents buried their dead, not in a separate cemetery, not in a designated space outside the settlement, but directly under the platforms where the living slept and worked. The skulls of ancestors were sometimes retrieved after burial, plastered with clay to recreate facial features, and kept within the living space, physical presences of the dead, maintained within the domestic world of the living. Archaeologists have noted that Çatalhöyük's social organization appears to have been remarkably egalitarian by the standards of comparable Neolithic sites. Skeletal analysis of individuals buried beneath the floors shows relatively uniform nutritional profiles and activity patterns across the population. Little evidence of the kind of differential access to food and labor that typically accompanies hierarchical social structures. Whatever organizational principle held this proto-city together and coordinated its construction and maintenance, it does not appear to have been coercive political power in the form we usually associate with early urbanism. One theory suggests that both Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük represent evidence of a cultural and organizational horizon in the ancient Near East that preceded the civilizations we typically credit with the invention of complex society, a horizon that was sophisticated, symbolically rich, and widely networked. But that left a material record thin enough that the standard model was built without fully accounting for it. Under this view, the question is not whether hunter-gatherers were capable of building Göbekli Tepe. The question is what kind of accumulated knowledge, transmitted across generations and potentially across large geographic distances, made that capability possible. The prior chain is what is missing. The earlier tradition, the rehearsal period, the accumulated craft knowledge that produced those carved pillars and those rooftop cities, it has not been found. It may be buried. It may be in the 5% of Göbekli Tepe, still waiting beneath the hill. It may be at a site that has not yet been surveyed. Or it may be, in some form, encoded in the texts of the civilizations that came after the ones that wrote down, in the world's oldest surviving script, a story about beings who arrived and taught humanity everything it needed to build a world. That is where we are going next. Every story has a version that travels, and a version that stays close to the ground. The version of the Lovelock Cave story that travels, the one that circulates in documentaries about lost civilizations and forums dedicated to suppressed archaeology, goes something like this. In a cave in the Nevada desert, miners and archaeologists uncovered the remains of a race of red-haired giants, some of them standing over 6 feet tall, who once inhabited North America before the ancestors of modern Native Americans arrived and drove them out. The Smithsonian Institution, in this version of events, quietly removed the most significant remains and locked them away because acknowledging their existence would destabilize the official narrative of American prehistory. The giants have been hidden. The truth has been buried. That version of the story is mostly wrong. But the reason it exists, the actual documented history of Lovelock Cave and what was found there, is genuinely interesting and genuinely complicated and deserves to be looked at clearly, rather than either amplified or dismissed. Lovelock Cave sits in Pershing County in northwestern Nevada, roughly 20 kilometers south of the town of Lovelock in the Humboldt Sink Basin. The cave is a natural limestone formation, roughly 40 meters deep and 24 meters wide at its mouth, that sits at the edge of what was once a large, shallow lake. The lake dried up thousands of years ago as the climate of the Great Basin shifted toward the arid conditions of the present day. What the receding water left behind was a cave that had been used by human populations for thousands of years, and whose dry, stable interior conditions had preserved the material they left there with unusual fidelity. The first systematic excavation of Lovelock Cave was conducted in 1912 by Llewellyn Loud, working under the auspices of the University of California. The excavation was not, by modern archaeological standards, carefully controlled. Much of the initial work was conducted by guano miners who had been extracting bat droppings from the cave for use as fertilizer before the archaeological significance of the site was recognized. A significant portion of the upper deposit was already disturbed or removed before Loud arrived. What he documented and recovered in the remaining material was nevertheless substantial thousands of artifacts, including woven basketry, duck decoys made from tulle reeds, projectile points, wooden implements, fiber cordage, and human remains. Loud's report, co-authored with Mark Harrington and published in 1929, remains the foundational document of the site's archaeology. The artifacts recovered from Lovelock Cave are now distributed across several institutions. The Nevada State Museum in Carson City holds a significant portion of the collection. The Hearst Museum of Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, holds additional material. The duck decoys, in particular, are considered masterworks of ancient fibercraft, some of the oldest and best preserved examples of this type of object found anywhere in North America, dated to roughly 2,000 years ago, with some organic material from deeper layers of the site producing dates extending back 4,500 years or more. Now, the human remains. Some of the individuals recovered from Lovelock Cave were, by skeletal measurement, relatively tall. Several male individuals fell in the range of what we would today describe as above average height, approximately 6 feet or slightly above. This is not, in isolation, extraordinary. Human height varies across populations and across time periods, and taller individuals have been documented at archaeological sites across the Americas without generating particular controversy. The skeletal material from Lovelock Cave falls within a range that, while somewhat toward the upper end of what was typical for Great Basin populations of that period, does not constitute evidence of a biologically distinct race of giants in any scientifically meaningful sense. The hair is a more interesting case. Several specimens of hair recovered from the cave were noted by early researchers as having a reddish or reddish-brown color. This observation made its way into Loud's report and subsequently into popular accounts, where it was treated as evidence of a racially distinct population with biological characteristics unlike those of known Native American groups. Archaeologists have noted, and this is a well-established point in forensic anthropology, that ancient hair frequently undergoes chemical changes after death that alter its apparent color. Dark or black hair can shift toward reddish, auburn, or even blonde tones through a combination of oxidation, mineral exposure, and microbial activity over long periods of time. The reddish coloration observed in hair from Lovelock Cave is consistent with this well-documented post-mortem transformation. It does not indicate that the individuals in question were biologically red-haired during their lifetimes. Several researchers who have reviewed the Lovelock material, including physical anthropologists who have examined comparable hair samples from other arid Great Basin sites, have reached the same conclusion. So where does the giant red-haired narrative come from? And why has it proven so durable? Part of the answer lies in the Paiute oral tradition, and it deserves to be handled with care. The northern Paiute people, whose ancestral territory includes the region around Lovelock Cave, preserve a tradition describing a people called the Site Ka, a name that translates approximately as 2 liters, a reference to the aquatic reed that dominated the wetland environment of the ancient Humboldt Sink. In this tradition, the Site Ka were a hostile population, physically distinct from the Paiute, who were eventually defeated and driven out or destroyed after a prolonged conflict. Some versions of the tradition describe the Site Ka as large in stature and red-haired. One theory suggests that the Site Ka tradition preserves a genuine cultural memory of a distinct population that inhabited the Great Basin wetlands before or alongside the ancestors of the Paiute, a population that was real, that was in conflict with neighboring groups, and that was eventually absorbed or displaced. Under this reading, the oral tradition is not mythology, in the dismissive sense of that word, but history encoded in the form that oral cultures use to transmit important events across generations. One theory suggests, alternatively, that the specific physical descriptions in the tradition, the red hair, the exceptional size accumulated over centuries of retelling, and may not correspond to the biological characteristics of the actual historical population being remembered. Oral traditions routinely emphasize the otherness of enemies and rivals, and physical exaggeration is a documented feature of how many cultures describe groups they were in conflict with. The core historical memory of a distinct wetland-dwelling population that was eventually overcome may be accurate without the physical details being literally true. What remains unexplained is the gap in the scholarly record after 1929. Lovelock Cave was excavated once, documented in one foundational report, and then largely left to the margins of academic attention for decades. A site that produced thousands of artifacts, including some of the oldest and best preserved organic material in North American archaeology, received a level of follow-up research that seems thin relative to its significance. Whether this reflects the practical constraints of Depression-era academic funding, the site's geographic remoteness, or some degree of institutional discomfort with the questions the material raised is difficult to determine from the outside. The Smithsonian dimension of this story requires the same kind of careful separation between what is documented and what is inferred. The Smithsonian Institution does hold a significant collection of Native American skeletal remains, this is not disputed. The scale of that collection, and the circumstances under which much of it was assembled during the 19th and early 20th centuries, are a legitimate subject of ethical and historical critique. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, established a legal framework for the return of remains and sacred objects to affiliated tribes. Implementation of that law has been slow and contested at multiple institutions, including the Smithsonian. These are documented facts, and they reflect a real pattern of institutional opacity around the treatment of indigenous human remains. What this documented opacity does not constitute is evidence that the Smithsonian or any other institution is suppressing proof of a race of ancient giants. The leap from legitimate critique of NAGPRA implementation to the claim that anomalous skeletal material is being hidden requires an evidentiary bridge that does not exist in the public record. The two things, institutional opacity around repatriation and the giant suppression narrative, have been fused together in popular accounts in a way that serves neither the legitimate grievances of indigenous communities nor the genuine archaeological questions raised by sites like Lovelock Cave. One theory suggests, and this is perhaps the most useful frame for understanding the whole Lovelock story, that the giant narrative was substantially constructed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by a regional newspaper culture that had both the appetite and the habit of sensationalizing archaeological finds. Nevada newspapers of that era published multiple stories about enormous skeletons and mysterious cave discoveries that, when traced back to their sources, either cannot be verified or describe findings that are considerably more mundane than the headline suggested. These stories entered the popular record, merged with genuine elements of Paiute oral tradition, and eventually became a composite account that is now almost impossible to cleanly separate from the underlying archaeology. What Lovelock Cave actually contains, and what the careful documentation of Loud's 1929 report describes, is a site of genuine and significant interest. A cave that preserves 4,000 years of human occupation in the Great Basin, artifacts of remarkable quality and age, evidence of a wetland culture adapted to an environment that no longer exists, and human remains whose height and hair color in the original documentation are notable without being extraordinary. The story that grew around those remains, amplified across a century of retelling, is not evidence of giants, but it is evidence of something else, of the way human cultures generate and preserve narratives about the beings who came before them, and of how difficult it becomes, after enough time has passed, to find the original signal beneath the layers of interpretation that have settled over it. That difficulty, the problem of separating memory from myth, documentation from embellishment, genuine anomaly from manufactured mystery, is going to be at the center of everything we look at from here on out. Because the next chapter of this story does not take place in a cave in Nevada. It takes place in the oldest written records in human history, and the beings described there were not discovered by miners or reported in local newspapers. They were recorded in cuneiform, on clay tablets, by a civilization that built the first cities on Earth, and they were described not as legends, but as fact. Writing changes everything. Before writing, history is carried in the body, in the practiced movements of hands that know how to knap flint or weave reed, in the words spoken aloud around fires that have been burning for so long, nobody alive remembers the first time they were lit, in the ceremonies performed at specific places, on specific days, because that is what has always been done, because the people who came before said it mattered, because something in the accumulated weight of generations says this is important, even when the original reason has faded beyond recovery. Before writing, history is alive but fragile. It breathes and shifts and loses edges over time. It survives only as long as someone is willing to carry it. Then, in the river valleys of what is now southern Iraq, sometime around 3200 BCE, a civilization called Sumer produced something that had never existed anywhere on Earth before. A system of marks pressed into wet clay that could record language with enough precision to survive indefinitely. Cuneiform, named for the wedge-shaped impressions left by a reed stylus, was not initially a literary medium. It was an accounting tool. The earliest tablets record quantities of grain and numbers of livestock. The bureaucratic impulse preceded the poetic one, but the poetic one followed. And what the Sumerians eventually committed to clay, the stories they chose to preserve in permanent form, once they had the technology to do so, included accounts of beings they called the Anunnaki that have been generating interpretive controversy ever since. The word itself appears across multiple Sumerian and later Akkadian texts. Its precise meaning has been debated by Assyriologists for over a century. The most commonly cited translation is something like those of noble descent, or those who came from the heavens to earth, though the second translation is disputed, and the specific meaning of the Sumerian prefix an, in this context, has been interpreted differently by different scholars. What is consistent across the texts is the role. The Anunnaki are presented as a group of divine or semi-divine beings who administered the world, who assigned fates, who made decisions about human civilization from a position of authority that human beings did not possess and could not challenge. The texts in which they appear are not obscure fragments. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the Anunnaki as participants in the original organization of the cosmos. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest flood narratives in recorded history, describes a moment when the Anunnaki, weary of the labor required to maintain the earth, create human beings specifically to take on that labor. The Eridu Genesis, considered among the earliest Sumerian literary compositions, places the Anunnaki at the center of the decision to grant civilization to humanity, agriculture, kingship, law, the organization of cities. The tablets that contain these texts are now housed in institutions including the British Museum in London and the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, where they have been studied by professional Assyriologists for generations. Henry Rawlinson began the serious decipherment of cuneiform in the 1840s, working from the trilingual Behistun inscription carved into a cliff face in what is now western Iran. The generations of scholars who followed him built a field Assyriology that has produced careful, peer-reviewed translations of hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, a joint project of the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Max Planck Institute, has now digitized more than 350,000 tablets. Thousands more remain untranslated. Into this body of serious scholarly work, in 1976, stepped Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin was a Russian-born author who had studied economics and journalism, not Assyriology. His book, The 12th Planet, proposed that the Anunnaki were not mythological figures, but literal extraterrestrial beings from a planet he called Nibiru, a body in an elongated orbit that brought it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. In Sitchin's reading, the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold, created Homo sapiens through genetic engineering as a labor force, and were the original source of human civilization. The book sold millions of copies and generated a publishing franchise that continued until Sitchin's death in 2010. The Assyriological community's response was clear and detailed. Scholars, including Michael Heiser, who held a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Thorkild Jacobson, one of the 20th century's most respected Sumerologists, examined Sitchin's translations and found them to be, in the most charitable assessment, idiosyncratic, and in the less charitable one, simply wrong. Sitchin's reading of the Sumerian word for planet, his translation of passages describing the Anunnaki's origins, and his interpretation of astronomical references in the texts were contradicted by the standard tools of Assyriological analysis. The Nibiru hypothesis has no support in the cuneiform record, as understood by credentialed specialists in the field. That is a clear statement, and it should be taken seriously. Sitchin's specific claims do not hold up, but here is where the conversation gets more interesting. because dismissing Sitchin's extraterrestrial interpretation does not resolve all of the questions the Sumerian texts raise. Some of those questions are harder, and they belong to the mainstream record rather than to the fringes. The Sumerian king list is a document that survives in multiple copies, the most complete of which is a clay prism now held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, dated to approximately 2017 BCE. The text records the names of Sumerian kings, the cities they ruled, and the lengths of their reigns. For the kings who ruled before the Great Flood described in Sumerian tradition, the recorded reign lengths are extraordinary. Alulim of Eridu, the first king on the list, is recorded as having reigned for 28,800 years. His successor ruled for 36,000 years. The total pre-flood reign lengths across 8 kings adds up to 241,200 years. Archaeologists have noted that the post-flood section of the king list transitions into historically verifiable territory, rulers and cities that correspond to actual archaeological sites and to individuals mentioned in other ancient Near Eastern documents. The list is not pure mythology. It is a hybrid document, moving from the legendary into the historical, using a single continuous format for both. What remains unexplained is the interpretive framework for the pre-flood figures. Scholarly explanations have included symbolic numerical systems based on Sumerian base 60 mathematics, astronomical cycles, and ritual significance. But no single explanation has achieved consensus in the published literature. One theory suggests that the Anunnaki texts encode a genuine cultural memory of an actual social stratum, a priestly or administrative elite who mythologized their own authority by describing themselves and their predecessors as divine agents, in the same way that Egyptian pharaohs were understood as living gods, or as the Japanese imperial line was historically described as descending from the sun goddess Amaterasu. Under this reading, the Anunnaki were real people, or real institutions, whose power was supernatural only in the stories told to justify it. One theory suggests something slightly different, that the Anunnaki tradition preserves a layered memory of multiple distinct populations, some of which were genuinely foreign to the communities that recorded the texts. The Sumerian civilization emerged with remarkable speed relative to the cultures that preceded it in the archaeological record of the region. The technological and organizational leap between the Ubaid period settlements that preceded Sumer and the full flowering of Sumerian city-states is steep enough that some researchers have asked whether external input trade, contact, migration, or knowledge transmission from another sophisticated culture might account for part of the acceleration. What remains unexplained is the astronomical knowledge embedded in the Sumerian record, the MUL. Apin tablets, a series of cuneiform astronomical texts dated to around 1000 BCE, but believed to encode observations and calculations inherited from significantly earlier periods, demonstrate a level of systematic sky observation that implies an accumulated practice stretching back centuries before the tablets were inscribed. The tablets record the rising and setting times of stars and planets, the paths of the moon through the zodiacal constellations, and mathematical relationships between celestial cycles that required sustained, precise observation across generations to establish. The knowledge did not appear with the tablets. It arrived with them, already mature, from somewhere earlier in the transmission chain. Where that chain begins is not visible in the surviving record. The Sumerian civilization appears in the archaeological record, already knowing things about agriculture, about astronomy, about architectural organization, about the administration of complex societies that took other cultures millennia to develop. The standard explanation is that Sumer benefited from the accumulated innovations of the Ubaid and earlier Neolithic cultures of the Fertile Crescent, and that the specific conditions of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta accelerated the development of complexity in ways that are archaeologically recoverable, even if not fully understood. That explanation is probably substantially correct, but it is also incomplete in ways that honest researchers in the field acknowledge. The gap between what preceded Sumer and what Sumer produced is real. The question of what filled that gap, what knowledge, transmitted through what channels, from what prior source, does not have a fully satisfying answer in the published literature, and in the meantime, the tablets sit in their museums, more than 350,000 of them, digitized, and waiting. Thousands more, untranslated, pressed into clay by hands that believed they were recording something important enough to preserve in permanent form accounts of beings who were present at the beginning of everything, who organized the world and assigned humanity its place within it, and who eventually withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs, leaving behind a civilization and a memory and a set of questions that 5,000 years of scholarship has not fully resolved. The next set of ancient texts we are going to examine was not pressed into clay. It was written on parchment and leather, then sealed into ceramic jars and hidden in a series of caves above the Dead Sea, where it sat undisturbed for roughly 2,000 years. And the beings it describes have a great deal in common with the Anunnaki, except that in this tradition, their arrival on Earth was not a gift. It was the beginning of something that the authors of the text believed had gone very, very wrong. In the spring of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat along the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The terrain there is harsh and pale limestone bluffs carved by wind and time into a landscape that looks, in certain light, like the surface of something that was never meant to be inhabited. Ed-Dib threw a stone into one of the cave openings to startle any animal that might be sheltering inside. What he heard instead of a goat was the sound of ceramic breaking. Inside the cave were clay jars. Inside the jars were scrolls. What followed over the next decade was one of the most significant archaeological recoveries of the 20th century. Between 1947 and 1956, excavations of 11 caves in the Qumran area of the West Bank, conducted under the auspices of what would become the Israel Antiquities Authority, and involving teams from multiple international institutions, recovered approximately 900 manuscripts in varying states of preservation. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as they came to be known collectively, contained the oldest surviving copies of most books of the Hebrew Bible, alongside sectarian texts, calendrical documents, hymns, and wisdom literature belonging to a Jewish community that had inhabited the nearby settlement of Qumran roughly 2,000 years ago. Among the recovered texts was a document that did not fit neatly into any of those categories. The Book of Enoch, more precisely, the work known to scholars as First Enoch, or the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, is a composite text attributed to the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, described in the Book of Genesis as a man who walked with God and was taken by him, never dying in the conventional sense. First Enoch is not part of the standard Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament, as used by most Western denominations. It was, however, considered canonical scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and was clearly regarded as authoritative by the community at Qumran. Multiple copies were found in the caves, more than almost any other non-biblical text in the collection. The section of First Enoch that concerns us here is called the Book of the Watchers. It describes a group of beings called the Erin in Aramaic, a word that translates as the Watchers, those who watch, those who do not sleep. According to the text, the Watchers were a class of celestial beings assigned to observe humanity from above. At some point, 200 of them made a collective decision that went against their assigned role. They descended. They took human women as partners, and from those unions came offspring. The text describes the offspring in terms that are difficult to translate neutrally. The word used in the Aramaic is Nephilim, a term that also appears in the Book of Genesis, in a passage that has generated more interpretive debate than almost any other verse in the Hebrew Bible. The Nephilim of First Enoch are described as enormous. The text gives figures that most scholars treat as symbolic rather than literal, and as possessing appetites and capacities that exceeded what the earth could sustain. The Watchers themselves are described as transmitting knowledge to humanity that was not meant to be transmitted: metallurgy, cosmetics, the reading of celestial signs, the making of weapons, the art of enchantment, forbidden knowledge, in the text's own framing, technology delivered before its time, or to a species not yet prepared to use it wisely. The Watchers were subsequently judged for what they had done. Their offspring were destroyed. The Watchers themselves were bound and imprisoned in the earth, awaiting a final judgment, and the world they had altered through their descent, their unions, and their transmissions of knowledge was cleansed by a flood and begun again. The parallels with the Sumerian material are not subtle. The Apkallu of Babylonian tradition, 7 sages, described as half human and half fish, or as beings who emerged from the sea, are credited in Mesopotamian texts with transmitting civilization to humanity before a great flood, after which their role shifted and their access to the human world was restricted. The Anunnaki transmission narrative and the Watcher transmission narrative follow the same structural arc. Beings from outside the human order descend or arrive, share knowledge that reorganizes human civilization, produce offspring or altered populations, and are then withdrawn or punished for the transgression their involvement represented. The same arc appears, with local variations, in the Vedic tradition's accounts of the Gandharvas and the Asuras, celestial beings who interacted with the human world and whose interactions produced consequences that required divine intervention to resolve. It appears in the Greek tradition's accounts of the Titans and the demigods, the offspring of unions between divine and human that produced figures like Heracles and Achilles, beings who possessed capacities beyond the human range, but who were also subject to mortality and suffering in ways the fully divine were not. It appears in Irish mythology's accounts of the Tuatha De Danann, a race of beings who inhabited Ireland before the arrival of the Gaelic peoples, who possessed advanced knowledge and supernatural abilities, and who eventually withdrew into the landscape itself, becoming the hidden people of Irish folk tradition. One theory suggests, advanced by scholars including David Souter at St. Martin's University, that the Book of the Watchers is best understood as a polemical text, a coded critique of the Jerusalem priestly establishment of the Second Temple period, using the language of mythological transgression to make an argument about illegitimate religious authority. Under this reading, the Watchers represent corrupt priests who had abandoned their proper role. Their unions with human women represent inappropriate alliances with foreign cultures, and their transmission of forbidden knowledge represents the introduction of syncretistic religious practices into what the Qumran community regarded as a pure tradition. The text is theology, not history. That interpretation is well supported and should be taken seriously. It is consistent with the sectarian character of much of the Qumran material and with the political and religious tensions of the period in which First Enoch was compiled. What remains unexplained is why the Watcher narrative in First Enoch draws on a set of physical and cosmological descriptions that have no clear precedent in earlier Hebrew literature. The vocabulary used to describe the Watchers, their appearance, their mode of descent, the specific nature of their physical interaction with human women reads, to specialists in comparative ancient literature, as drawing on a source tradition that is not Israelite in origin. Some researchers have noted affinities with Mesopotamian mythological texts, which is consistent with the known cultural exchange between Israelite and Babylonian traditions during and after the Babylonian exile. But the specific combination of elements in the Watcher narrative, the organized group descent, the systematic knowledge transmission, the hybrid offspring, the divine punishment and binding does not map cleanly onto any single identified source text. It reads, in other words, like a synthesis, a drawing together of multiple older traditions into a single, coherent account. And if that is what it is, the question becomes, and what experiences or memories did they encode before they were incorporated into the text that ended up sealed in a ceramic jar above the Dead Sea? Now comes the moment where two categories of knowledge, one ancient, one very recent, need to be placed in careful parallel. The Book of the Watchers describes beings of a lineage distinct from humanity who descended into the human world, produced offspring with human women, and left genetic traces in the human population. The text treats this as transgression, as catastrophe, as the origin of a problem that required a flood to partially resolve. Ancient DNA science, in the last 15 years, has confirmed that Homo sapiens interbred with at least two distinct archaic hominin populations, Neanderthals and Denisovans, and that the genetic contributions of those populations are present in the genomes of living humans today. Statistical modeling by the laboratory of David Reich at Harvard Medical School has further suggested the existence of at least one additional archaic population, sometimes called Population Y, in analyses of ancient South American genomes, or referenced as the Australasian signal in studies of early migration patterns that contributed to modern human ancestry without leaving any recovered fossil in the archaeological record. A ghost lineage. In the technical vocabulary of the field, a population that touched us genetically without leaving bones we can find. The parallel being drawn here is not that the Watchers were Denisovans. That claim would be irresponsible and is not supported by evidence. the parallel is more careful and more interesting than that. It is this: the narrative of beings from a distinct lineage who interacted with humanity, produced hybrid offspring, and left traces that persisted in the human population across tens of thousands of years is not purely the product of ancient imagination. It describes, in mythological language, something that actually happened repeatedly across the deep human past, in encounters whose genetic evidence is only now becoming readable. Whether any of those encounters were consciously remembered and encoded into texts like First Enoch, or whether the narrative is an independent cultural construction that happens to parallel the genetic record by coincidence, is a question that cannot currently be answered. What can be said is that the two categories, ancient myth and modern archaeogenetics, are describing the same basic phenomenon from different angles and with different vocabularies. Beings of another lineage were here. They left something of themselves in us. And then, in the physical record at least, they were gone as silently and as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind nothing but the faint signal written in our DNA and the ancient, faded memory preserved in texts that were sealed in jars and buried in caves and carried across 2,000 years of history to reach us. The question of what that means, what we are supposed to do, with the knowledge that our species has always been less alone than we thought, and less singular, and less the sole authors of what we became, is not a question that archaeology or genetics can answer on its own. But it is, perhaps, the most important question the evidence raises, and it is the one we are going to sit with as we move into the final sections of this film, where the individual threads we have been following begin, finally, to pull toward each other. At some point in any investigation, you stop looking at individual pieces and start looking at the shape they make together. We have spent 8 sections doing the close work, examining specific sites, specific bones, specific texts, specific genetic datasets. We have been careful about what the evidence supports and what it does not. We have named the researchers, cited the institutions, flagged the contested claims, and tried to hold the line between documented anomaly and unfounded speculation. That discipline is necessary. Without it, this kind of material collapses quickly into a fog of assertion where everything proves everything and nothing can be falsified. But there is a different kind of observation that becomes available only when you step back far enough to see the whole field at once. And that observation is this: every major civilization that has left a written or pictorial record has preserved, somewhere in that record, an account of beings who were present in the world before the current human order existed. Beings who were distinct from ordinary humanity in some combination of their origin, their knowledge, their physical characteristics, or their relationship to the forces that govern the natural world. Beings who interacted with humans sometimes as teachers, sometimes as rulers, sometimes as partners, sometimes as adversaries, and who eventually withdrew, were defeated, were transformed, or went underground in some sense, leaving behind a changed world and a persistent memory of their presence. This is not a pattern that appears in 2 or 3 cultures and can be attributed to borrowing or diffusion. It appears across every inhabited continent, in traditions separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, in cultures that had no documented contact with each other at the time. Their foundational texts and oral traditions were being formed. The Sumerian Anunnaki, the Babylonian Apkallu, the Hebrew and Enochic Watchers, the Vedic Gandharvas and Asuras of the Indian subcontinent, the Greek Titans, and the demigod offspring of divine and human unions, the Tuatha Dé Danann of Irish tradition, the technologically superior race who preceded the Gaelic peoples and eventually retreated into the landscape, the Hunahpu figures of the Mayan Popol Vuh, the beings of the first and second creations who were destroyed or transformed before the current human world was established, and the Wandjina, the creator beings depicted in rock art in the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, in images that have been dated to somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, painted with large rounded heads, large eyes, and an absence of mouths, returning periodically to replenish themselves and their connection to the living world. 8 traditions, 8 distinct cultural contexts. The same basic narrative architecture, running through all of them. Archaeologists have noted, and this is an important counterweight to hold throughout this section, That cross-cultural similarity in ancient religious and mythological themes does not automatically imply a shared historical source. David Lewis Williams, emeritus professor at the University of the Witwatersrand and one of the leading researchers in the cognitive archaeology of ancient art, has argued extensively that many of the visual and narrative similarities found across ancient sacred traditions can be accounted for by what he calls the entoptic phenomenon, the fact that the human nervous system, when entering altered states of consciousness through trance, fever, fasting, or ritual practice, generates a consistent set of geometric visual experiences that are neurologically hardwired rather than culturally transmitted. Spirals, grids, nested curves, luminous figures, the sensation of descent or ascent through tunnels. These appear in the sacred art of cultures worldwide, not because those cultures shared a historical connection, but because they shared a nervous system. This is a serious scholarly argument, and it accounts for a meaningful portion of the cross-cultural similarity in ancient visionary and religious material. But it does not account for everything. The entoptic phenomenon explains geometric visual similarity. It does not fully explain the narrative specificity of the pattern we are looking at, the consistent structural elements of descent from a higher order, knowledge transmission, hybrid offspring, withdrawal or punishment, and the altered world left behind. Those are not visual experiences generated by the nervous system under stress. They are plot structures, and plot structures of that complexity and consistency, appearing independently across multiple continents, require a different kind of explanation. One theory suggests that the pattern reflects genuine cultural memory, that the beings remembered across these traditions were, in some cases, real populations. Not supernatural beings in any literal sense, but archaic hominin populations or distinct human groups whose presence in the landscape was experienced by the ancestors of modern humans as profoundly other, as possessing knowledge or capacities that the encountering population did not have, as being physically distinct in ways that registered as significant, as interbreeding with the local population in ways that left lasting traces in both the genetic record and the cultural memory. Over tens of thousands of years of oral transmission, the memory of those encounters was elaborated, mythologized, invested with divine significance, and eventually committed to writing in the forms we now study as mythology. The timeline makes this plausible in ways it would not have been 20 years ago. The confirmed interbreeding events between Homo sapiens and Denisovans, and between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, occurred over a period stretching from roughly 50,000 to perhaps 100,000 years ago. Modern humans were present in Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, according to dating of the Majid Baby rock shelter site in the Northern Territory, published in Nature in 2017. The ancestors of the people who would eventually record the Wandjina in Kimberley rock art had been in that landscape for 60,000 years before the oldest dated paintings were made. Whatever they encountered or remembered in that deep span of time, whatever meetings or conflicts or minglings happened in those tens of thousands of years that left no written record, was available to be drawn on when the pictorial tradition began. One theory suggests something that operates at a different level of analysis entirely, that the convergent narrative is not about memory at all, in the historical sense, but about the universal human experience of encountering the limits of what the known world can explain. Every culture, at some point in its development, confronts evidence that the world it inhabits was shaped by forces it did not initiate and cannot fully account for. The landscape bears the marks of prior occupation. The genetic inheritance includes characteristics whose origin cannot be traced. The knowledge base contains elements whose source has been forgotten, and the human mind, confronted with these gaps, generates a narrative to fill them, a narrative about powerful beings who came before, who shaped what exists, and who left when the current order began. The specific details vary by culture. The narrative structure is universal because the cognitive need it serves is universal. Both theories, the cultural memory hypothesis and the cognitive universality hypothesis, can be true simultaneously, in different proportions for different traditions. The Denisovan genetic signal in Tibetan and Melanesian populations is real, and its source is confirmed. The narrative of beings who came from elsewhere and left something of themselves in the local population may, in those specific cultural contexts, be drawing on a memory that has genuine historical content at its core, however, elaborated and transformed by the centuries of transmission that sit between the original encounter and the recorded text. In other traditions, the same narrative structure may be operating primarily as a cognitive template rather than a historical record. The categories are not mutually exclusive. What remains unexplained is why the institutional response to this convergence has been so consistently minimal. The cross-cultural pattern is not a secret. Comparative mythologists, including Joseph Campbell, documented it extensively across the 20th century. And the academic field of comparative religion has been mapping its contours for generations. What has not happened, in any sustained or well-funded way, is a serious interdisciplinary effort to bring the tools of archaeogenetics, cognitive archaeology, and comparative textual analysis to bear on the pattern simultaneously to ask, with the full resources of contemporary science, whether the convergent narrative has a recoverable historical component, and if so, what that component was. The absence of that effort is not evidence of suppression. Large-scale interdisciplinary research programs are expensive, logistically complex, and tend to fall between the funding categories of established academic disciplines. The institutional conservatism that keeps researchers working within established paradigms rather than across them is structural and well documented in the philosophy of science literature. It does not require malicious intent to produce significant gaps in the research record, but the gaps are real, and they are large enough that sitting with the pattern, looking at the Anunnaki and the Watchers, and the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the Wandjina, and the beings of the Popol Vuh, all in the same field of view, produces a question that the existing literature has not answered cleanly. Why did every ancient culture, independently, remember the same thing? The beings were here. Every tradition says so. The traditions disagree about almost everything else: the beings' names, their appearance, their motivations, the nature of their knowledge, the reason for their departure. But on the central fact, the agreement is complete, and it crosses every boundary of geography and language and time. Something was here before the world became what it is now. Something that shaped us, and left, and was remembered. The question of what that something was has been sitting in the record, ancient and silent, for longer than any institution has been equipped to answer it. There is a difference between a cover-up and a silence. A cover-up requires intent. It requires someone, or a group of someones, making a deliberate decision to suppress specific information because that information threatens something they want to protect: power, funding, a narrative, a career. Cover-ups happen. History is full of them. But they are also, in practice, much rarer than the word suggests when it circulates in popular culture. People talk, documents surface. The mechanisms required to maintain active suppression across multiple institutions and multiple generations of researchers are considerable, and they tend to leave traces. A silence is different. A silence can arise from institutional inertia, from funding structures that reward certain kinds of questions and starve others, from the social dynamics of academic fields where anomalous findings carry career risk, from legal frameworks that create genuine ethical obligations but also produce practical barriers to research, and from the simple fact that the people in charge of large collections of ancient material are almost always overworked, underfunded, and dealing with more demands on their time and resources than they can adequately meet. A silence does not require anyone to be malicious. It requires only that the conditions for open inquiry be less than fully present, and those conditions are almost never fully present anywhere. What we are going to do in this section is look at 3 specific, documented cases where the institutional record shows something other than full transparency. We are going to be precise about what is documented and what is inferred, and we are going to resist the temptation present on both sides of this conversation to make these cases either smaller or larger than the evidence supports. The first case is Kennewick Man. In July of 1996, 2 college students wading in the shallows of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, found a human skull in the riverbank sediment. What followed was one of the most protracted and revealing legal and scientific disputes in the history of American archaeology. The skeletal remains nearly complete, belonging to an adult male were dated by radiocarbon analysis to approximately 8,500 to 9,300 years ago, making them among the oldest human remains ever found in North America. Initial morphological analysis by forensic anthropologist James Chatters suggested that the skull's features did not correspond straightforwardly to the skeletal profiles of known Native American populations, though subsequent analyses produced more varied assessments on this point. 5 Native American tribes, the Umatilla, Yakama, Nez Perce, Wanapum, and Colville, filed for repatriation of the remains under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA, which was passed in 1990. The Army Corps of Engineers, which had jurisdiction over the land where the remains were found, moved to comply with the repatriation request. A group of 8 physical anthropologists filed suit to prevent repatriation, arguing that the remains were of sufficient scientific significance that study should be permitted before any repatriation occurred. The legal battle lasted 9 years. During much of that period, the remains were held by the Army Corps of Engineers under conditions that multiple researchers described as inadequate for the preservation of irreplaceable ancient material. In 2004, a federal appeals court ruled in favor of the scientists, finding that the government had not established the cultural affiliation required by NAGPRA to justify repatriation without study. Scientific analysis was conducted between 2005 and 2012. In 2015, ancient DNA analysis by a team including Eski Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen confirmed a genetic affiliation with contemporary Native American populations, and the remains were repatriated and reburied in 2017. What the Kennewick Man case documents is not a conspiracy to hide an anomalous skeleton. The morphological ambiguity that generated initial controversy was substantially resolved by the DNA analysis. What it does document is an institutional response, specifically the Army Corps of Engineers' aggressive legal posture in favor of repatriation before study that was driven by political considerations rather than scientific ones. The internal communications of the Army Corps during the dispute, which became part of the public legal record, show an institution primarily concerned with avoiding conflict with tribal governments and with the political exposure that scientific controversy would create. The scientific questions were secondary to the institutional management of a difficult situation. That is not suppression of evidence, but it is a case where institutional priorities produced a 9-year delay in the study of one of the most significant ancient skeletal finds in North American history. The distinction matters, but so does the outcome. The second case is the broader NAGPRA implementation record. NAGPRA was and remains a genuinely important piece of legislation. The history of how Native American human remains ended up in American museum collections is, in many cases, a history of grave robbing, of remains taken without consent from burial sites across the continent, of a 19th and early 20th century scientific culture that treated indigenous bodies as research material rather than as the remains of people deserving of dignity and respect. The law was a necessary corrective to a documented pattern of institutional harm. What remains unexplained is the gap between the law's mandate and its implementation. As of 2023, after more than 30 years of NAGPRA, the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History held approximately 110,000 Native American skeletal remains in its collections, with roughly 30,000 identified as potentially subject to repatriation claims. The pace of actual repatriation has been slow, slowed by the complexity of establishing tribal affiliation for very ancient remains, by funding constraints on the museum's repatriation office, and by the sheer logistical challenge of processing a collection of that scale. The Smithsonian situation is not unique. Institutions across the country are in various stages of compliance with NAGPRA, and the overall record is one of incomplete implementation rather than active resistance. But the effect, from the perspective of both tribal communities seeking the return of their ancestors and researchers seeking access to ancient material, is a collection of remains that exists in a kind of institutional limbo, present in the record, visible in the inventories, but practically inaccessible for either repatriation or scientific study, while the administrative process grinds slowly forward. One theory suggests that this limbo is not accidental, that large research institutions have a structural incentive to maintain control over significant collections, even when the ethical and legal case for repatriation is clear, because collections represent institutional prestige, research capacity, and grant-attracting potential. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is an observation about organizational incentives that is supported by a straightforward reading of how academic institutions operate. The incentive to hold does not require anyone to consciously decide to obstruct. It simply makes the path of least resistance the one that keeps the collection in place. The third case involves Egypt, and it requires the most careful framing of the three. The Giza Plateau site of the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx is administered by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, now reorganized as the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. Independent researchers and some credentialed archaeologists have, over the past several decades, sought permission to conduct subsurface surveys of the plateau using ground-penetrating radar and seismic equipment. The Egyptian authorities have granted some of these requests and declined others, and the decision-making process has not always been transparent about its criteria. Archaeologist Mark Lehner, who has conducted extensive and rigorous work at Giza over several decades under the auspices of Ancient Egypt Research Associates, has consistently argued that the plateau has been more thoroughly studied than popular accounts suggest, and that the evidence does not support claims of hidden chambers or undiscovered structures of significant scale. Lehner's work represents serious, peer-reviewed scholarship and should be weighted accordingly. What remains unexplained is why certain subsurface anomalies identified in surveys conducted in the 1990s by independent researchers anomalies that were reported to the Egyptian authorities and that would be straightforward to investigate with modern equipment have not been followed up with published results. The anomalies in question may be geological rather than archaeological. That is entirely possible and perhaps probable, but the absence of published follow-up means that the question remains open in the record, which creates exactly the kind of vacuum that speculation fills. One theory suggests that the Egyptian government's management of access to Giza is driven primarily by concerns about tourism revenue, national heritage, politics, and the desire to maintain Egyptian institutional control over Egyptian cultural patrimony, all of which are legitimate considerations rather than by any desire to conceal specific findings. This is almost certainly the more accurate explanation. It is also an explanation that produces, as a side effect, a research environment in which anomalous findings can sit unresolved for decades without anyone being obligated to address them. And that, finally, is the honest summary of what institutional silence looks like in practice. Not a room full of people deciding what the public is not allowed to know, but a combination of legal complexity, organizational incentive, political sensitivity, funding constraint, and the ordinary bureaucratic friction of large institutions operating under competing pressures, producing, collectively, a record with gaps in it that are larger than they should be. The beings we have been tracing through this film left their evidence in those gaps, in the unstudied collections, the unexcavated enclosures, the untranslated tablets, the unanalyzed skeletal material, sitting in storage, while the paperwork moves slowly through channels designed for a different purpose than finding answers. The evidence is not hidden. It is simply, in many cases, not yet reached, and the tools that might finally reach it, ancient DNA sequencing, ground-penetrating radar, artificial intelligence-assisted translation of cuneiform, are newer than the gaps themselves, which means that what the next decade of research produces may be more consequential than anything the last century has uncovered. That is where we are going next. Something changed in the last 15 years that did not get nearly enough attention outside the academic communities where it happened. Not a single discovery. Not one site or one skeleton or one translated text. Something more foundational than any individual finding a shift in the tools themselves, in the instruments available to the people asking the questions, in what is now technically possible that was not possible before. And when the tools change at this level, when the resolution of the available instruments increases by orders of magnitude, the map does not just get updated, it gets redrawn. We have been living through exactly that kind of redrawing, quietly, in laboratories and field stations and server rooms, over roughly the same period that this film has been covering. And the findings that have emerged from it are already beginning to close some of the gaps we have been examining, while opening others that are stranger and larger than the ones they replaced. Start with the ancient DNA revolution, because it is the most direct continuation of the Denisovan story we opened with. When Svante Pääbo's team published the Neanderthal genome in 2009, the sequencing required to produce that result was expensive, slow, and technically demanding to a degree that made it accessible to only a handful of laboratories worldwide. The cost of sequencing a complete ancient genome at that point ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The process required specialized cleanroom facilities to prevent contamination from modern human DNA, which is present essentially everywhere in any environment where researchers work, and which can overwhelm the ancient signal in a degraded sample if even minor contamination occurs. By 2023, the cost of sequencing had dropped by a factor of roughly 10,000 from its peak. The techniques for extracting and authenticating ancient DNA had been refined to the point where usable genetic material could be recovered from skeletal elements, particularly the petrous bone of the inner ear, which preserves DNA better than almost any other tissue in the body that were previously considered too degraded to yield results. Laboratories running ancient DNA programs had expanded from a handful to dozens, distributed across Europe, North America, China, and Australia. The result has been an acceleration of discovery that the field is genuinely struggling to keep pace with. In 2016, a team led by David Reich at Harvard Medical School published a paper in Nature, analyzing ancient DNA from 69 individuals across Europe, reconstructing patterns of prehistoric migration and population replacement that had been completely invisible to the previous generation of archaeologists. Working from skeletal morphology alone, that paper represented more genetic data from ancient Europeans than had been collected in all prior research combined. Since then, the Reich Laboratory and comparable programs at the Max Planck Institute, Copenhagen University, and institutions across Asia and Australia have produced a cascade of findings that are collectively rewriting the human population history of every inhabited continent. Ancient migrations that left no clear trace in the archaeological record have been identified through patterns of shared genetic ancestry. Population replacements, events where one group was largely or entirely displaced by another, sometimes within a few centuries, have been documented in regions where the skeletal record showed apparent cultural continuity, and ghost lineages, populations that contributed to the genomes of living people without leaving any recovered fossil, have been identified on multiple continents. The Australasian signal is one of the most consequential of these. Statistical analysis of ancient and modern genomes from South America has identified a component of ancestry in certain Amazonian and other South American populations that is more closely related to Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians than to the northeastern Asian populations that are the primary ancestral source for most indigenous Americans. This signal appears in ancient individuals from Brazil dated to roughly 10,000 years ago. It implies the presence, in the ancient Americas, of a population that arrived by a route and at a time that does not fit the standard model of the initial peopling of the continent through the Bering Land Bridge. Archaeologists have noted that this finding does not require a transoceanic voyage or any other dramatically anomalous dispersal mechanism. There are plausible models involving coastal migration routes along the Pacific Rim that could to account for the genetic signal without requiring extraordinary circumstances, but it does require the presence in the ancient Americas of a population carrying Australasian ancestry, and that population has left no clear skeletal record that has been identified and accepted by the mainstream literature. Another ghost, another lineage that touched us and then disappeared from the physical record, surviving only as a signal in the genomes of people who did not know they carried it. Now step back from the laboratory and look at what has been happening from the air. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is a remote sensing technology that works by firing rapid pulses of laser light at the ground from an aircraft and measuring the time it takes for the reflected pulses to return. By processing the return data, researchers can generate three-dimensional models of the terrain beneath whatever is sitting on the surface, including forest canopy, vegetation, and centuries of accumulated debris. For archaeology in forested regions, where traditional aerial photography sees only treetops and ground survey is slow and incomplete, LiDAR has been transformative in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate. In 2018, the Pacunam LiDAR Initiative published the results of a survey covering roughly 2,100 square kilometers of the Guatemalan lowlands, a region that had been studied by Maya archaeologists for over a century, using ground, survey and aerial photography. The LiDAR data revealed 60,000 previously unrecorded structures. Not 60, not 600, 60,000 interconnected cities, raised causeways linking settlements across the landscape, agricultural terracing, and water management systems operating at a scale that implied a classic Maya population 3 to 4 times larger than previous estimates had suggested. An entire layer of human civilization sitting beneath the forest canopy, invisible to every research tool that had been applied to the region before. The lead researchers, including Marcello Canuto at Tulane University and Francisco Estrada Belli at Boston University, described the findings as the most significant advancement in Maya archaeology in decades. The paper was published in Science in 2018. It is not a fringe claim. It is peer-reviewed, multiply-verified, and has already generated a generation of follow-up research. What it means, in the context of this film, is straightforward. A region that had been studied for over 100 years, by generations of dedicated professional archaeologists using the best tools available to them, contained 60,000 unrecorded structures. The gap between what we thought we knew and what actually exists in that landscape was not a matter of a few missing details. It was a matter of fundamental scale. If that gap existed in one of the most intensively studied archaeological regions in the Western Hemisphere, the magnitude of what remains unknown in less studied regions, the interior of Borneo, the river systems of Central Africa, the highland plateaus of Central Asia, where Denisovan populations may have lived for hundreds of thousands of years, is genuinely difficult to estimate. Göbekli Tepe's ground-penetrating radar surveys, conducted in 2021 by a joint team from Istanbul Technical University and the German Archaeological Institute, identified the signatures of at least 16 additional enclosures beneath the hill surrounding the excavated site. The 2 enclosures that have been most fully studied represent what now appears to be a fraction of the complete complex. The excavation of those additional enclosures, at current funding levels and dig season schedules, is projected to take generations. Now add the third tool, because it operates on a different category of the unknown entirely. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, a joint project of the University of California, Los Angeles and the Max Planck Institute, has digitized more than 350,000 cuneiform tablets from collections across the world. The tablets span roughly 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history and cover subjects ranging from grain inventories and legal contracts to astronomical observations, medical texts, mythological narratives, and royal correspondence. An estimated 30% of the digitized tablets remain untranslated. The untranslated portion includes tablets from collections that have not been fully catalogued, tablets whose deterioration makes manual translation extremely difficult, and tablets whose content falls into specialized subject areas where the number of qualified Assyriologists worldwide is measured in the dozens. In 2023, a research team at Stony Brook University published results from a natural language processing model trained on digitized cuneiform texts. The model demonstrated the ability to assist in the translation of damaged and partially legible tablets by predicting missing or illegible signs based on context. The cuneiform equivalent of autocomplete, operating on a 3,000-year-old writing system, the accuracy rates reported were not perfect. They were not intended to replace human specialists, but they represented a meaningful acceleration of the translation pipeline, and the technology has continued to develop since the initial publication. What those untranslated tablets contain is unknown by definition. They may contain administrative records of no extraordinary significance. They may contain additional copies of texts already known from other sources. They may contain texts that have no parallel in the existing literature accounts of events, beings, or knowledge whose content has been sitting in museum storage, inaccessible, for a century or more, waiting for a combination of digitization, computational power, and trained specialists to make them readable. One theory suggests that the acceleration of all 3 of these technologies, ancient DNA sequencing, LiDAR survey, and AI-assisted translation over the next decade, will produce a volume of new findings that the existing interpretive frameworks of archaeology, genetics, and ancient history will not be fully equipped to absorb, that the pace of discovery is already outstripping the pace of interpretation, and that the gap between what the tools can find and what the institutions can process and publish is itself becoming a source of significant delay in the public understanding of ancient history. Archaeologists have noted, and this is a direct observation from researchers working in the field rather than an inference, that the problem of the next generation is not finding the evidence. The evidence is there, in the ground and in the storage rooms and in the digitized archives. The problem is having enough trained people, enough funded positions, and enough institutional flexibility to ask the right questions of the evidence once it is recovered. The beings we have been following through this film, the Denisovans, the ritualizing hominins of Rising Star Cave, the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the populations remembered in the oldest texts on Earth, left their traces in exactly the kinds of places these new tools are now reaching. In the degraded bone of inner ear structures, beneath the forest canopy of landscapes that have never been fully surveyed, in the damaged signs of tablets that have resisted translation since they were first digitized, the answers are not hidden. They are simply waiting for the instruments that can finally read them, and we are, for the first time in the history of this inquiry, living in the moment when those instruments exist. We started with a cave in Siberia, a single fragment of a child's finger bone recovered from a limestone cliff above the Anui River, sitting in a laboratory at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, yielding a genome that described a branch of humanity nobody knew existed, a ghost lineage, written in bone, present for hundreds of thousands of years across a territory stretching from the Altai Mountains to the islands of the Pacific, leaving almost no physical trace beyond the faint genetic signals still carried today in the bodies of people in Tibet and Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australia. We started there because that discovery confirmed, peer-reviewed, awarded the Nobel Prize establishes something that matters for everything that followed it. The human story is not as complete as we thought it was. The map has blank spaces, and some of those blank spaces, when the right tool is finally applied to them, turn out to contain entire populations that the previous version of the map had no room for. Over the 11 sections that followed, we looked at what happens when you take that established fact seriously and follow it into the wider record. We found a small-brained hominin descending into absolute darkness in Rising Star Cave, carrying its dead to a chamber that required navigating an 18-centimeter passage to reach, and possibly marking the walls of that chamber with geometric shapes that predate the arrival of Homo sapiens in that space. We found elongated skulls in museum cases in Lima, whose anatomical specifics have sat unresolved in the published literature for nearly a century. We found a monumental temple complex on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, built by hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago, and then deliberately buried, whose construction implies a chain of accumulated knowledge, whose prior source has not been located. We found the same narrative beings from outside the human order who descended, transmitted knowledge, produced hybrid offspring, and withdrew preserved independently in the foundational texts of Sumer, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Vedic tradition, in Greek mythology, in Irish legend, in the rock art of the Kimberley, in the sacred stories of the Maya. And we found institutions not villainous, not conspiratorial, but structurally constrained, politically cautious, and underfunded, sitting on collections and unexcavated sites and untranslated tablets that the next generation of tools may finally be able to read. Here is the honest summary that the evidence supports. 3 of the 8 beings we examined are confirmed science. The Denisovans existed, interbred with Homo sapiens, and left genetic traces that are still present in living populations. Homo naledi existed, displayed behavioral complexity that challenges the standard relationship between brain size and cognition, and occupied southern Africa contemporaneously with early Homo sapiens. The ghost lineages identified by ancient DNA research, Population Y in Amazonia, the Australasian signal in ancient South America, represent real populations whose full story has not yet been recovered. 3 occupy a middle territory of documented anomaly without definitive explanation. The subset of Paracas skulls displaying single parietal plates has not been fully accounted for in the published literature. The builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed and transmitted a level of technical and symbolic knowledge whose prior source remains unlocated. The Lovelock Cave material sits at the intersection of genuine archaeology, indigenous oral tradition, and a century of embellishment that has made clean analysis difficult but not impossible. 2 remain in the territory of interpretive mythology, whose value lies not in literal fact but in pattern recognition. The Anunnaki and the Watchers are ancient texts, not field reports, but the pattern they encode beings of a distinct lineage who shaped humanity and left is no longer purely mythological in its implications. It describes, in the language available to the people who wrote it, something that ancient DNA science has now confirmed in the language available to us. The interbreeding happened, the distinct lineages were real. The myth and the science are not describing the same thing in the same way, but they are, at some level of abstraction, pointing in the same direction. What do we do with that? The answer that this film has been building toward is not a dramatic one. It is not a revelation or an exposure or a call to distrust the institutions that manage the ancient record. It is something quieter and, in the long run, more useful than any of those things. Pay attention to what the tools are finding. The ancient DNA revolution is not finished. LiDAR surveys have covered a fraction of the forested and remote landscapes where the evidence of prior populations may be waiting. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets remain untranslated in digitized archives. The 5 enclosures partially excavated at Göbekli Tepe represent perhaps 5% of the complete site. Rising Star Cave has additional chambers that have not been fully explored. The inner ear bones of ancient skeletal material sitting in museum collections across the world have not all been sampled for DNA. The beings were here. The evidence of their presence is distributed across the physical record, in forms that range from confirmed genetic fact to deeply contested anatomical anomaly to ancient text. Some of what we have examined in this film will be clarified by the next decade of research into something cleaner and more certain. Some of it will remain contested, and some of what the next decade finds will almost certainly open questions that are stranger than any we have been sitting with tonight. The most profound mystery in all of this is not any single skull or cave or tablet. It is the question of why every civilization, independently, on every inhabited continent, preserved a memory of a time when the world was shared. When humanity was not alone, when beings who were not quite like us walked the same landscapes, possessed knowledge we did not have, and left something of themselves behind when they were gone. That memory is ancient. It is distributed across every culture that has left a record, and it is sitting in parallel with a body of genetic science that says, in the precise language of nucleotide sequences, that the memory is not entirely wrong, they were here before us. In some form, biological, cultural, genetic, or all three simultaneously, they are still here, written into the architecture of the human genome, encoded in the oldest stories any civilization thought worth preserving, buried beneath hills that have barely been touched by the tools that could finally read them. The question is not whether they existed. The question is what we are willing to do with the record they left behind. And that question, ancient, unanswered, and growing more interesting with every passing year of research, belongs not to the past. It belongs to whatever comes next.